Omar Baddar has been one of the most important voices we have since the genocide began. He is, of course, a Palestinian-American analyst. I don't really need to keep banging on about how great he is because his work speaks for himself. And if you haven't heard of him so far, then sort it out, fix it. I just want to go straight into it. Let's just go straight in. We were just talking, actually, just before I press record. 14 months of this genocidal mayhem, some of the worst imaginable atrocities committed every single day, some of them live streamed. Is this a sense, I mean, of this terror of normalization? Because, you know, I always try to say to the audience, never, ever let this be normal. Never, ever stop being shocked. But, I mean, would you have imagined 14 months on, this horror would still be going on? And what does that tell us?
Yeah, Owen, really not in my wildest dreams did I ever imagine that this would drag on for as long as it did. There's a way in which when genocide is unfolding, you have to put your life on hold and say, this is an emergency. This is the primary thing we're dealing with right now. And more than a year into it, with still no end in sight and things being absolutely horrific day in and day out, in order, you know, just for basic self-preservation, you can't help but find some way to normalize the absolutely abnormal. On a moral level, you should never normalize what is unfolding. But in order to be able to go on with your daily life, to maintain a job and a family and just function, you have to, in some ways, allow this to drift a little bit back to the, you know, into the background in a sense. Never obviously giving up the fact that we do have to fight this day in and day out in ways that we can, but also I'm realizing that I can't be constantly in emergency mode, you know, burning into my sleep, and just thinking about this all the time is absolutely exhausting. And you can't help but also feel some level of survivor's guilt. In order for me to preserve my basic life, I feel like I need to take a step back. But the people who are living through it don't have that luxury at all. This is their daily reality, as horrific as imaginably possible. And to think, you know, today, just the day that we were talking, there is this news of 66 people being killed in Gaza. And to imagine what it's like to be one of those people who has had to endure all of this, the starvation, the mass killing, the just living in hell, watching the apocalypse unfold before you. And then you don't get to survive at the end of it. You get to live through this hell for well over a year, and then you might still get killed at the end of it, or watch your immediate family members get killed. It's unconscionable, and it's no longer, you know, there was a time in which there could be a debate, from my perspective, not among informed observers, about what Israel's intent is. To me, it was quite obvious that going after the civilian population in Gaza was the intent, but there was room for argument among people who are less informed. But at this point, you've got the leading, biggest human rights organization in the world coming out with a report outlining and detailing how this is actually genocide. There really is no more room for debate. And it's hard to state, you know, you can't overstate the moral failure of our world order, our leading governments, in allowing this genocide to unfold for as long as it has, and still not being able to step in and say enough is enough.
The last video uploaded is an interview with Amnesty International about their crucial report on the genocide, which you referred to there, which takes apart the dire bad faith criticisms. And you said, no, there's no place to hide, the evidence being as overwhelming as it is. A question I want to fire at you. I put this actually to the Israeli journalist Gideon Levy, which is that the Israeli earlier this week, the Israeli state might say, you know, they'll go, well, you know, you can denounce us for what we've done. We are winning, full of triumphalism. Look at the strategic picture. Yes, we've raised Gaza to the ground and wiped it up. You know, so many innocent people off the face of the earth. I mean, to be honest, it sounds like absurd that I'm paraphrasing Israeli officials like that, but actually some of them do speak like that anyway. But I mean, what would you say to that in terms of, is that hubris in terms of what the strategic map, I guess, of the Middle East at the moment? What do you think about that in terms of that triumphalist narrative which is in play?
Yeah, hubris is, I think, the perfect word to really describe it. Now, I also want to have some humility in saying that there is an instinctive part of human nature that says the bad guys never win at the end, that if you carry on like this, your end has to, the end of your behavior, things are not going to end well for you if this is how you conduct yourself. But to be frank, when you think of the story of Native Americans and what white settlers have been able to accomplish, and at this point, yes, we look back and the entire world agrees that what white settlers did to Native Americans in the United States is an atrocity. There's an understanding that that kind of genocide, we say if you could take time back, you would never do the same thing again. But it's all too late to do anything about. And I'm mindful of that, is that even though I have absolute, complete, and total confidence in the fact that history will not judge Israel kindly for the way that they have conducted themselves, I don't have the same confidence that there's going to be meaningful, real consequences on the ground. And that's what worries me in some way, is that in the absence, their reputation in the world is utterly destroyed. They'll never come back from that. This entire notion of Israel as a beacon of democracy and freedom and human rights in the Middle East and all this utter garbage and nonsense, I think that's dead. So nobody's going to buy this narrative anymore. But if you're going to live by brute force and you're going to have European and the American government come back and aid you in every way possible in order for you to fulfill what is obviously underway right now, the complete liquidation of the Palestinian struggle for freedom and justice, the elimination of the Palestinian national struggle, that is what is unfolding right now. It is premature to say how this is going to turn out. And I think it is, speaking of unbelievable arrogance, for Israel to act as if this is a done deal and everything is fine from this point forward. But it's also not completely out of the realm of possibility that they do win the strategic fight at the end of the day, and that later on they can make reforms, they can get rid of the leaders who are responsible for this genocide and say we have changed, but by then Palestine is no more. That's a possibility. And I think that there is an urgency from my perspective whenever we talk about justice being inevitable. Yes, it's true, the arc of history always bends towards justice, but if Palestine is no more, if you victimize hundreds of thousands of Palestinians, if not millions of Palestinians by the end of this, I think that's not an option. We have an absolute immediate need to act in every way that we possibly can to put an end to the slaughter before it's too late and to save what is left to be saved. Gaza will never be the same again. It's just impossible for it to come back from that level of devastation. Still, every day, every week, every month longer that we allow this genocide to go on, we are talking about countless families that are being obliterated, entire bloodlines, people's children. You are fundamentally losing out on a segment of the population that would otherwise exist if we were able to put a stop to it. So the strategic map is looking pretty dire at this point, with what happened in Lebanon, with what happened in Syria. And if we can dive into those bits, actually, I'm happy to talk about those real quick. In terms of,
go for it, sorry.
No, after you, go ahead. I'll let you frame it.
Well, just on Syria, it's interesting actually because Israel has invaded Syria and bombed Syria repeatedly and destroyed its military capabilities. But interestingly, the new Syrian government has filed its first report to the UN Security Council, and it's a denunciation of the Israeli invasion of Syria. It says the Syrian Arab Republic condemns in the strongest terms this Israeli aggression, which represents a serious violation of the 1974 disengagement agreement. That's the ceasefire agreement negotiated between the Assad regime and Israel in 1974, which Benjamin Netanyahu unilaterally said no longer applied, which is a legal nonsense, obviously, because the Syrian state still exists. It's just a different government. It says it constitutes a violation of the sovereignty of the Syrian Arab Republic and the unity and strength of its territories, and inconsistent with the principles and purposes of the United Nations Charter, the provisions of international law, and UN Security Council resolutions that they cite as well. What do you think about that? I mean, in terms of that's interesting because actually some were disturbed, I think, by the lack of a response by the Syrian government, notwithstanding it just emerged. We don't know its character really at the moment properly. What do you think in terms of what's happening in Syria, what it represents, the invasion, and just, the fact the Syrian government have now come out against it?
Yeah, look, I mean, just in terms of what Israel is doing in Syria and what has done for the past several days, it's just unbelievable that, again, just the fact that we're giving Israel a pass. Constantly, Israel is treated like a country that is above the law and above the rules, and they get to do whatever they want. Even before the past few days, Israel is illegally occupying a huge part of Syria, the Golan Heights. And the claim was we can't give up the Golan Heights, even though they're Syrian, because we need that as a buffer zone to prevent any possible Syrian attack, and we need that kind of land as a buffer zone, effectively. And what Israel has done since is taken more land inside Syria, and they're claiming that as a buffer zone to protect the land that they claim is a buffer zone. It's just transparently an attempt at expansion and kind of stacking the deck against the incoming Syrian government whenever it forms, that if you want any part of this land back, you're going to have to negotiate a deal with us. And a deal entails allowing Israel to hold on to the Golan Heights and making sure that Syria abandons the Palestinian cause and no longer is a supporter of Palestine in any serious and meaningful sense. What they want of Syria is to become like many other Arab governments in the region that are effectively within the US orbit, which is to say you're allowed to say whatever you want about solidarity with Palestinians as long as you don't meaningfully do anything. And a lot of these governments maintain trade relations with Israel. Everything is normal with Israel. They maintain Israeli embassies. They express outrage about what Israel is doing in Gaza, but it's obviously not serious outrage, because if it were, you would not maintain these kinds of diplomatic relations and trade relations with Israel. You would put your money where your mouth is, and you would say no more relations with this country until this genocide ends. But that's not what they do. It is all a performance for their populations. And I think what Israel hopes to get out of Syria is a very similar arrangement, where it's fine to express solidarity with Palestinians for public consumption, but when push comes to shove, you're not going to lift a finger to do anything to support Palestinians. And more importantly, you're going to have to recognize that the Golan Heights is now a part of Israel. Just allow Israel to annex Syrian territory and be okay with it. And that's the mass devastation that we're seeing. And when you listen to Western officials talk about how Israel has legitimate security concerns and that's why they're doing what they're doing, just imagine the opposite scenario. Everybody knows that Israel is constantly threatening to strike Iran and Iran's nuclear facilities. So Iran has a legitimate security concern when it comes to Israel. But if Iran started unloading on the Israeli Navy, devastating it, and bombing several hundred points throughout Israel, including, major cities, nobody would defend that as an act of self-defense or say they have legitimate security concerns. Everybody would understand that as an act of aggression. But somehow when Israel does it, it is always okay. And that's just, again, an infuriating reality. And the way that we engage with this, people are noticing. People in the region see the double standard. It doesn't sit well with them. And sooner or later, they're going to rebel against it. When we look at Syria itself, and I think it's worth separating those things, that for many years, by the way, leading up to this, you've had many fights over Syria between people who say the al-Assad government is a brutal, repressive regime and Syrians deserve to be free from it. And then on the other side, you would say there is this Western conspiracy that includes Israel and many other states and some Arab states conspiring to overthrow the Syrian regime as a way to defeat regional resistance against Israel. And what's been ironic about this fight is that neither side is wrong. They're just choosing to focus on one particular piece of the picture and using it to argue. But the reality is Syrians deserve to be free from this repressive regime. And at the same time, you can't deny the fact that what is unfolding in Syria, the reason why it was facilitated by neighboring countries that have tight relations with Israel, there's even some reporting about how the rebel offensive was armed by Turkey, but facilitated in coordination with the Biden administration as well. You can't ignore the fact that these are not people who are concerned about human rights in Syria. When you look at the way they behave throughout the entire region, when you look at Turkish policy towards the Kurds, when you look at American policy towards Palestinians, there isn't a real concern about people's freedom and democracy and human rights. Obviously, something else is at play. But I also don't want the geopolitics of it to get in the way of recognizing basic Syrian humanity and the fact that there is a genuine feeling of joy right now in Syria over the overthrow of that government. But the challenge is what comes next. And the challenge for Syria right now is that between the religious fanatics and fundamentalists who are part of the opposition and the kind of climate they might create within Syria of religious fundamentalist rule, of attacks on minorities, that is one threat. And then the other threat is the threat of regional bullying, in which other countries in the region try to basically determine what Syria's strategic position is going to be, effectively in service of Israel's position of dominance in the region. And if the Syrian people can overcome both of these threats, I think Syria will be an incredible example of prosperity and an example of how you actually fight for your rights and win. And I think it'll be an inspiring example for the entire region. But I'm deeply worried about Syria's ability to overcome both of these threats, given the extent of the effort that is being poured in by regional countries in order to facilitate an agenda that is not really the Syrian people's.
I mean, just in the spirit of how we started and never ever normalizing what we see before us. I mean, you know, we've seen Israel just lay waste to so much of Lebanon. We've seen obviously Gaza. We've seen the pogrom in the West Bank, and we've seen in terms of, you know, attacks beyond that. I mean, far beyond that. The idea you can just say a military of a new government, which hasn't even established itself yet, could be a potential threat. So we're going to invade and we're just going to wipe it out. You know, the fact that isn't portrayed all over the media as, you know, this is, I mean, you barely even saw Israeli invasion of Syria. Like, the coverage didn't even use invasion. They just sent their tanks a few miles away from Damascus, the capital. I mean, you just have to, what does that tell us? Just the sheer level of impunity, both in terms of the international order and within our media.
Yeah, and it's really that disgusting internalization of the Israeli narrative. Our media covers this from the perspective of Israel. Israel is the protagonist. And if you enter that story with that emotional presupposition that you're just going into it feeling like Israel is the protagonist and then writing the story, everything that follows naturally. That's really the fundamental problem. It's the underlying orientation with which we cover the Middle East. We view Arabs and Muslims and, you know, other people throughout the region as other, and we always look at it the perspective of Israel as an extension of the West somehow. And we're looking through the prism of the way that Israel looks at the region. What threats are there and what's not there? And, you know, we understand it when we extend it to our own countries, right? When U.S. media acts like the U.S. is above the law, and, you know, we say Iran can't have nuclear weapons, but the US gets to have nuclear weapons. Nobody examines that bias. It's kind of understandable when you have these kinds of biases. But when you extend that bias to a foreign country, to me, that's even more incomprehensible. It's one thing to try to challenge people on the biases that they have towards themselves. It's another to ask, why on earth does this one foreign country that is an apartheid regime that is in the midst of committing genocide, why do you extend to them that automatic feeling of us and viewing everything they do as inherently defensive? There really is no coherent explanation for this. And I wish more people would actually examine it, because it is absolutely distorting to the way the coverage is made, and by extension to the way our politicians engage with the story. And it influences the way audiences emotionally feel about this. Even though a lot of people think that Israel has gone overboard and too far, the more fundamental framing of Israel as an aggressor and an occupier, that is a lot less understood. I think people oppose the genocide in the West largely because of how grotesque the conduct is, that it's beyond anything that anybody has imagined, and it's impossible to deny how monstrous it is. But the more underlying narrative of understanding that Israel is doing this intentionally, and that it is doing it in a project of expansion at the expense of other people and their rights, that is less understood. And I think if that's better understood, you can start seeing a more significant shift in the way people behave about this politically, and in a way that could actually influence policy in a more meaningful way too.
Just finally, I want to just circle back to where we started, really, and it just develops on what you just talked about there, and the theme, I suppose, what we've talked about in terms of normalization. Because, you know, for the last 14 months, I've always tried to just put aside what I know about the dynamics, the history, all that kind of stuff, and just constantly say, I cannot believe this is actually happening. And, you know, I've always got to remember as well the lane I'm in. I'm a white guy. I'm not Palestinian. I'm from Stockport in Northern England. But it is happening, and it has happened, and it has been allowed to happen for 14 months. And no genocide has been so documented and confessed as it was happening in the history of our species. And it's been facilitated by the dominant powers on Earth, on Earth and its allies, and normalized. And I just think to myself, there's no going back from that. There has to be, that is like a nuclear bomb going off in the fabric of the world somehow. I don't know, there's probably a better way of framing that. I don't know. That's the kind of, you know, I keep coming up with these things which I just come up with my head and then just throw at people just without any build up. So I apologize for that. Do you know what I mean, though? What do you not think? I just don't think there's any way back from that. And the consequences of that, I think, are so unpredictable, actually. You know, you just can't unleash that level of violence, of such an obscene kind of violence in terms of who is murdered and slaughtered and the way that happens, and then not be catastrophic consequences. What do you think in terms of where this leads all of us, the world, humanity? I don't know.
Yeah, absolutely. No, I think you are absolutely spot on in the sense that we've pretended as a species to have gone beyond a certain point. The entire reason we created the international law order, the UN, and all of that, it's on the back of World War II. It is saying that there is a certain kind of atrocities that is no longer allowed. And if they were to happen, there would have to be immediate accountability for them, a way to prevent the world from coming to the brink the way we have before. And here we are with an entire population being destroyed before our eyes. And it is live streamed for the entire world to see. And there isn't that international action to actually put an end to it, that there is this level of apathy that we're seeing from the world's most powerful countries and governments, ranging from either excusing it to being satisfied merely condemning it and moving on as if nothing really meriting involvement is occurring before us. That shatters our entire sense of collective world community. This when we talk about the entire world as all of this rhetoric about us being one people and about belonging to this planet and surviving beyond borders and so on, it is just clearly that it was a pretense. It's something that we're willing to go along with as make nice rhetoric when things are going well, but then when something horrific happens and a powerful country is behind it and a more powerful country is backing it, everybody's happy to just look away and not get involved. That, I think, shakes certainly my conception of where we are as a species. I believed foolishly at some point that we were past this point, and clearly we are not. And in terms of the organic consequences of it, of doing this to an entire population, of the entire world watching this unfold, I have no doubt that there's going to be massive blowback that goes in very, very erratic directions. I'm deeply worried about the future and the dynamics in the region. We're not out of it yet. Yes, Israel is making these strategic gains in the region to some extent, but they still have their eyes on Iran, and Iran is a very big and powerful country. And if Israel feels emboldened to just go after them directly, all bets are off about how things unfold from here. We are still in a very, very deeply dangerous moment. And every day that we fail to act to put an end to this genocide is a day in which we are playing with fire and getting closer and closer to the brink. And it's genuinely difficult to put into words how grave the situation that we're in today and how disappointing the world has turned out to be in terms of how it's dealt with this for the past 14, 15 months.
Amen. Well, you always put what you have to say very beautifully, very, very eloquent words as ever. Damning, chilling, educating. It's always such an honor to have you on. And I know how much the audience here hugely appreciates always hearing from you. So to that audience, please do, I suppose, respond in kind by sharing the video, leaving your comments, pressing like, because then more people watch the video. That's the idea, isn't it? That's why we're here. But Omar, honestly, what a pleasure as ever. Thank you so much for your eloquence and your wisdom.
Thank you very much, Owen. I really appreciate your voice on this as always.